CM coffees better than other processed coffees? Better is a very subjective word. Depends on what you like. If I had to give just a one-word answer, the answer is no. They're different, not necessarily better. Are all CM coffees 90 plus? In a word, no. CM coffees are more about flavor experiences, so they're less about cup score and more about what you can express with a coffee. So you can go anywhere from something that tastes like an incredible fruit bomb to something that tastes floral and refined and delicate. Sometimes that will be a 90-point experience, sometimes a 94-point experience, sometimes an 88-point experience. So it's more about the experience, less about the cup score. Today, I will be brewing an El Salvador Pacamara CM. Technically, it's a bourbon. What is the difference between CM and anaerobic? Okay, anaerobic just implies the absence of oxygen. CM means cherries have gone into a tank and then they've been charged with carbon dioxide as well. Technically, all fermentation happens in an anaerobic environment because fermentation creates CO2. But the difference is that with a carbonic maceration coffee, you put the cherries in and you charge with CO2 straight away. You're not waiting for the cherries or the pulped coffee to create CO2 first. You're introducing into the environment. Okay, how do you choose what varieties to use for CM processing instead of traditional processing? I would say that when it comes to variety choice, it's not necessarily the case that you choose one variety over another for CM processing. I think any variety can have success with CM processing. It would depend on what kind of CM processing, the temperature of the environment, whether it's a washed or a natural, and I guess the length of time you ferment for. But typically when we're choosing what variety to put into a CM process, we're looking at what are the inherent attributes of that variety, particularly with a typical washed or natural process, and then what can CM bring to enhance that coffee and bring it to either a new and unique level or a higher quality level, and then we would decide what CM processing to do on that basis. So some varieties may actually really shine when CM processing is applied to them, and others may not respond all that well. What's with the gemstones for CM? When we first began creating what we had called then experimental coffees, now it's more intentionally crafted, but we experienced an intensity of flavor that was new and unique to us. And that became the driving force. It was following flavor. In particular, we found that those flavors started to land in particular categories of color, if you want to think of it that way. So really clear red flavors, or really clear darker colored flavors, or really clear light and more refined flavors. And as a way of experiencing coffee and the sensory analysis, our team has always found color to be a useful way to describe flavor. So then we looked at how do we connect that in a way that might be more universal. Is diamond the most expensive profile? Short answer, no. The value of the CM coffees is more to do with their overall quality, how rare that particular coffee lot is, which might be connected to both the origin and the variety, but also the processing method. And how does it cup? How unique is the profile overall? So that basis is really what determines the price that a particular CM coffee has, not so much the category. Okay, for anyone who's never understood the CM process before, fair enough. So, at the farm level, you have a coffee tree growing coffee cherries. When the coffee cherry is ripe, pick the cherries, and now you're in post-harvesting processing. There's a lot of different things you can do at that point. You can pulp a coffee and wash it, you can just take the skin off and dry it as a honey, or you can just put it on the bed in the whole cherry as a natural. CM processing doesn't take away or change any of that, it adds a step. So in the case of a CM washed, you would take the cherry, you would put it in a tank, not just one cherry, you take a whole bunch of them. You put it in a tank, you charge that tank with CO2, you let it ferment. After the relevant fermentation time, you would take it out of the tank and then you would pulp it and you would wash it so all the mucilage comes off. Then you would send it to a drying bed. That's one version of CM washed. The other version is that you pulp it and you take the mucilage off before it goes into the tank. So coffee gets pulped and then the pulped beans go into a tank, gets charged with CO2 and then it gets left there to ferment. And then after the fermentation, it gets pulled out, it gets washed, all the mucilage is thoroughly washed off, and then that gets sent to the drying bed. They would both be considered CM washed because when the coffee goes to the drying beds, it's a washed product. There's no skin on it anymore. How much longer does CM take compared to traditional drying and processing? You're only really adding the fermentation time in the tank. The drying time would remain the same. So for example, a washed coffee might take 14 days to dry as an average. A CM washed, if it was going to be in a tank for say 3 days, then you have the fermentation time in the tank, and then the drying time after it comes out of the tank would still be about 14 days. So now the whole process from when it was a cherry to when it was finalized might be 17 days instead of 14. What do we do if CM tastes really bad? Okay, there's a couple of different things that we do. It would depend on what country we're in, what coffee we've made, and how bad it tastes. One of the things we pride ourselves with CMs is we always go into the processing arrangement with a producer with these details cleared up in advance, and these details, the risk sits on project origin and not on the producer. So before we create anything in an experimental way or a enhanced processing type way, we agree how much we're expecting to bring out, like how much coffee, and what we're going to pay for it when it's done, regardless of if it's good or bad. Because it's not the producer's responsibility to do that bit, it's our processing techniques. So if it goes bad, we still pay for it. We always buy the coffee. We don't always necessarily import the coffee or sell it to anybody else. So the producer gets paid for what they've produced, and then sometimes if it's really bad, like in the case of something that goes really wrong and maybe you get a phenolic defect with a coffee, we would sell it to the local market in that country and we wouldn't necessarily promote it anywhere. That would be one way of handling a really bad coffee. If it was just like we wanted it to be, you know, a Jasper type profile that was hopefully in the 87 or 88 point cup score, and it ended up being more like an 85 and it tasted like a typical natural, then we wouldn't release it as a CM Selections coffee because it doesn't make the criteria we're after. But you might just have it as a, say, a bulk natural that might get blended with some other things because the profile suits that method. But the producer would still get paid what was agreed regardless of that outcome. Can you make CM coffees in any origin? Technically the answer is yes. The process is just a process that you could apply to anything really. So you take a coffee cherry, put it in a tank, charge it with CO2, let it ferment for a certain period of time, and then you bring it out, you either pulp it or you just send it to the drying beds. That can be done anywhere, yes. Do we do it everywhere? No. In some cases it's not for any particular reason than that we haven't started doing it in a particular country. But also our goal with CM is to really enhance the flavour experiences of particular coffees. So it made sense obviously to work in the countries that we already have strong connections, strong relationships, particularly because it can be risky, this can go wrong. It makes sense to start with producers who we know how they already work, we know how they already farm their coffee, we know the health of the trees and the cherries and the typical standard that we would get from those places. So then you're taking that baseline and you're seeing what more value can you create, what new things can you create, and what value can you create for a roaster, for Project Origin and for the producer. Any chance for more Opal profiles? Yes, absolutely. We do replicate as much as we can the things that work, that we know have worked. The reality is though, you're dealing with weather patterns that we can't control, and also agronomical practices and an agricultural product that doesn't behave the way you expect it to all the time. So sometimes the exact same process or the exact same processing recipe does not create the exact same end result, because the cherries that you're using in one harvest compared to the previous harvest, they might have had a different journey. The way they grew, the maturation time, the brix content, the pH, that might not have been the same as it was from that exact same place, that exact same variety in the year previous. So the outcome isn't always. What are the benefits of doing CM over regular processing? This would depend on the situation of the producer, I would start by saying. A producer that doesn't have a lot of crop and doesn't have much risk to take, doesn't necessarily want to risk any of their cherries to possibly create something more interesting at a higher value, might not find that much benefit working with a CM coffee. But the real benefits that we see in CM are that you can create more unique flavor profiles using the same baseline. So as an example, I'm drinking Bourbon CM Natural from Los Pyreneos. Now, the standard Bourbon natural process from Los Pyreneos is beautiful. It can be anywhere from an 85 point to an 87 point cup, and it will be citric, chocolate, toffee, good body, well structured. When we apply the CM process to that exact same coffee, depending on the type of CM recipe we give it, you might then push into an indigo, which is like what I'm drinking now. And now you've pushed flavor intensity into darker flavors. So now I've got something that tastes like blueberries, tastes like dark chocolate, tastes a bit like dark plum and grape, where the typical Bourbon Natural didn't taste that way. Why would you do that? So when we initially started this program with Gilberto Barahona, the interest was he wanted to experiment. He wanted to create different things with the coffee from his farm. And so in doing this, he has now the Bourbon Natural product and the Bourbon CM Natural product from the same farm using the same trees. He had the capacity to create two different things, and you could potentially sell that to two different markets. Or in some cases, the same roaster buys both of those things rather than just the one, because they taste different and they can release them differently. Can we explain the lot names? To be honest, the lot names are typically just identifiers to allow us to track a lot from when it got harvested, when it got processed, and when it got milled, through to shipping and selling. So most of them are numeric, and the numbers just change over the years so that we can track each different coffee. It also means from one year to the next, if we see a code, we will be able to recognize what harvest year it came from. So that's typically what the lot numbers refer to, yeah. Any advice for roasters roasting CM coffee? Yes, these coffees can behave very differently to traditionally processed coffees. In our experience, we can see a coffee of a particular category, let's say Jasper, roasted by, roaster A in a particular way, might express exactly like that. It's red, it's raspberry and chocolate and things like that. Roasted by a different roaster, maybe they roast a little bit lighter, for example, you may find that the reds are still there, but they might be a little bit softer, potentially even pushing into orange type flavors or colors. Doesn't mean the coffee is not a Jasper, but it's a representation of everyone along the chain. So potentially it won't always be red depending on how it's been roasted and how it's been brewed as well. That absolutely makes a difference. The same could be said if you took that same coffee and maybe roasted it at a bit of a higher temperature or a bit more aggressively, or developed a little bit more, you might push outside of red into darker colors now. So you might actually find yourself on a borderline with an indigo type profile. And so that's where the roaster gets to actually add some of their own, personality or flair to a particular CM coffee. But it also creates a little bit of variability, because that same coffee roasted different ways can express itself differently. What's the best CM I've ever had? Okay, maybe this isn't fair because it's one of the freshest ones in my head, but a recent CM experience, which we are going to release this year, is actually an El Salvador, again, Los Pyreneos, Sudan Rame, CM, there's a natural and a honey. And it's incredible. Yeah, which is also particularly powerful because I remember walking on the farm with Gilberto maybe the year before he passed away, where the Sudan Rame was growing and the trees were 2 or 3 years old, and he was talking about here how in a year or two they're going to start producing enough sort of commercially available cherries. And it was his son last year that said to me, hey, do you want to work with some Sudan Rame because we have some volume? I was like, yes please. And that coffee is really impressive. So yeah, that's one of the best ones off the top of my head.